Longest 30 seconds ever. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this afternoon at the American Enterprise Institute to talk about spectrum management. I have with me former chairman of the Communications Commission, Ajit Pai, who served at the FCC from 2017 to 2021, and we've had the good fortune of having him around AEI the last couple of years as well. He is a graduate of both Harvard University and University of Chicago Law. He worked as a lawyer in the Department of Justice and the Senate Judiciary Committee. He also did 2 years over at Verizon, but he is currently a partner at the private equity firm Searchlight Capital, and he has been since 2021. So Ajit, thank you for joining us today. And I also have the honor of having Commissioner Carr, who is sitting at the FCC right now as we speak. He is at the FCC as well since 2017. He was appointed by former President Trump, and he is a graduate of Georgetown University and Catholic University from 2005 to 2007. He was an associate at Wiley Rein, where he left Wiley Rein to be a law clerk for Judge Dennis Shedd, and then went back to Wiley, and has been spending quite a bit of time at the FCC, and we appreciate you still being there. So welcome, Carr.
Yeah, so good to be with you. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had started this week with a national strategy plan by the Biden administration coming out, and you put out a statement. So let's start there, because we had a lot to talk about beforehand, but we have even more to discuss today. So you, in your comments, said that you were a little concerned that they are freezing up actually zero spectrum, as was in this plan. So give us an idea of what you think should have been included from the terms of the specific bands and timelines that could have been helpful, that we could have been, a little further along this Friday if we had gotten some direction from the Biden administration.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you. Most Americans don't really have any clue about spectrum bands or frequency or the airwaves. What they do understand is they want their phone to work when they flip it on. They want the data to be fast and affordable. They want more competition for in-home broadband. And what they don't realize is it is the airwaves that make that happen. And the more spectrum that we open it up, the better it is for consumers here in America. But more broadly than that as well, spectrum is an area where it is vital for geopolitical politics and our leadership. And when America is freeing up spectrum, making spectrum available for consumer use cases, the entire world takes notice and they follow our lead. It puts a wind at the back of U.S. officials and allied nations as they are negotiating, piece by piece, how the airwaves should work on a global basis. And the reality is this: we have been behind the rest of the world before when it comes to spectrum. In 2015 and 2016, America was about 300 megahertz, to put a number out there, behind the world when it came to spectrum for 5G. Again, the oxygen for those next generation use cases. And then flash forward for the time that Chairman Pai was chairman of the FCC, and I had the great honor of working for him and then alongside of him at the agency. And the FCC went to work right away at addressing that spectrum shortfall. And we freed up over 6,000 megahertz of spectrum for licensed use case alone. Again, there's things called licensed spectrum, unlicensed, and then sort of lightly licensed, a blend. But over 6,000 megahertz of spectrum in very, very short order. We did it pursuant to a plan that the chairman laid out called the 5G Fast Plan. And we leapfrogged the globe. And that's what we saw America lead the way on 5G. New innovations taking place here on our networks, not just connecting Americans, but also bringing jobs and opportunities here. And that was a great thing. Unfortunately, we have seen quite a pivot during the last 3 years with the Biden administration. Right now, we're falling behind other countries. We're on average about 300 megahertz behind other countries when it comes to mid-band spectrum, part of the sweet spot for 5G. And we're even further behind China. They're really outpacing us right now on the availability of spectrum. And so it's an urgent moment right now. And the Biden administration had an opportunity to meet that moment with this national spectrum strategy that's been much anticipated. It came out, thankfully, very timely for this event earlier this week on Monday. And it was a moment that the Biden administration had to deliver results. It needed to identify specific spectrum bands and put out a timeline for when that spectrum would move into the commercial marketplace, a calendar or a pipeline, as we call it. And they whiffed. The Biden administration's plan, after 3 years of study, says that they should continue to study. It doesn't free up, as you noted, even a single megahertz of spectrum. And that's a bad sign for America's leadership, as I'm sure we'll get into. We're heading into, as a country, this thing called the World Radio Conference, which is kicking off very soon here in Dubai. And we can get more into that down the road. But basically, as we go in this international conference, we do so stuck playing defense. And the administration really needed to deliver on that plan, and it didn't. So we got to try to find a way to correct course here.
So to kind of help with a little baseline explainer, can you walk us through this idea of a pipeline? Because that's one of the things that you all put in place or helped put in place with the World Radio Conference the last time they met was, kind of so this concept that we're behind, how are we, can you explain how we're behind and how the pipeline was meant to work when you put it forward?
I'd be happy to. First, though, Shane, thanks to you and AI for hosting this conversation. It's great to be with you, and it's always a pleasure to be alongside my former FCC colleague, Commissioner Carr, who's done a spectacular job talking about this issue up to and including today. The spectrum pipeline is very critical for wireless innovation in the United States. And as Commissioner Carr elucidated, every consumer is very familiar with smartphone applications. And since the dawn of commercial wireless, the one constant has been that consumers are always requiring more and more bandwidth to handle the ever more advanced applications and services that are out there. And so the spectrum pipeline is basically a way for the government to signal to consumers and to industry, these are spectrum bands that we think are usable for next generation wireless services. And we are going to move particular bands on an identifiable time frame into the commercial side of the ledger so that companies and ultimately consumers can benefit from them. And that's something that we did very aggressively during my tenure. We published what I call the 5G Fast Plan. And we looked at all these different bands, and we didn't just sit there and talk about it and think about it and study it. We actually did it. We made them available for auction. And in many cases, it was very difficult to do so because a lot of these spectrum bands have incumbents in them. There might be other federal government agencies that are using those spectrum bands or other commercial entities. And so the job of the FCC, as well as the entire administration, the executive branch, is to work together to make sure that to the maximum extent possible, those public airwaves are put to use for the benefit of the public. And we did that very successfully. I remember very fondly an article that came out in the middle of 2020, and the title was something like "A Cheap Pie is Making Lots of Enemies on the Road to 5G." And the article was slanted around, we're angering this or that federal agency, this or that constituency in the commercial side. But the reason was because you have to be very aggressive in making sure that consumers have a voice in putting these public airwaves to work. And I'm glad that we did that. And as Commissioner Carr has described very well earlier this week, the unfortunate thing about the so-called national spectrum strategy is that it is missing spectrum, which is kind of a critical input when you're talking about a pipeline that will give wireless innovators a chance to continue to innovate here on our shores.
So there seem to be two parts to this, and I want to get to the global part first, and we'll come back to the more domestic challenges. But because you mentioned World Radio Conference, so you mentioned we're behind China. How do we get behind China? Because I get this idea that everybody keeps saying they're very organized and they're very ready for this World Radio Conference, and I believe is it 1,200 megahertz that they're well, anyway, you can tell me, what they're planning on, really getting into the market. So what are they doing that seems to have some of our entities in this space concerned, and why is global harmonization so important?
Go ahead. Yeah, Commissioner Carr, you can take it.
Start.
Sure. Yeah. So, again, how do we fall behind? Part of the challenge we have in the U.S. right now is the federal government, different agencies like DoD have something like 12 times the amount of mid-band spectrum reserved for the federal government as compared to what's available in the consumer market. So as the chairman was walking through, one of the key pieces, although not all of it, but one of it is to find a way to work with our agencies, federal agencies, to free that spectrum up for the private sector. And you mentioned this conference that we're going into. We're not only trailing on average, like I said, almost 400 megahertz. We rank 13th out of 15th in terms of these sets of countries with availability for licensed mid-band spectrum. As we go into this conference, China and its delegation is supporting the introduction of 5G mobile wireless services and almost 1,500 megahertz of spectrum spread across something like 5 separate spectrum bands. In contrast, the U.S. delegation is going into this global conference only pushing for 5G or for use cases that we prefer in 2 spectrum bands. So we're stuck in this position now without a spectrum pipeline, without the administration delivering spectrum in this plan playing defense on a global scale. And that's really not a good situation to be in. Again, we're behind China, and they're pushing for 5G and use cases that they want in many, many bands. And I don't agree with China that 5G should be necessarily in all the places that they're advocating it. But the point is their country has a plan, and they're working to execute on it. So the next 3 or 4 weeks as that conference takes place is going to be important to see if we can try to get any sort of win out of that. But again, we got to turn it around. And that's why, when I first started moving out of the majority into the minority here, one of the very first things I did was gave a speech with you in March of 2021. And that's where I laid out a very concrete plan. By the end of 2021, we should move on this spectrum band. 2022, 2023, 2024, identified specific spectrum bands in specific amounts of spectrum in the years by which we need to move them. That's called a plan. And flash forward to today, and we really haven't made any progress on any of those spectrum bands that I noted. Had we done so, that would have made sure that we kept moving at the same pace and cadence that we had from 2017 through 2020. And again, the benefits of freeing spectrum are not just international, but the average download speed in this country on the mobile side increased 6-fold from 2017 to a couple months ago. Big increase. And you can only do that when you have spectrum. But this administration isn't leaning in, and frankly, this FCC is not leaning in. We've got 2.5 gigahertz licenses that we auction, and we're one at auction, and people paid us millions of dollars for, and we're just sitting on them. And there's no reason to. We should be issuing those licenses immediately. We already should have. Had we issued those licenses, something like 50 million Americans could get new or better wireless service virtually overnight. And we're not moving forward on it. And it's a shame. Now, some people will note, as we can get into, that the FCC's auction authority itself, our ability to conduct spectrum auctions and move it in the marketplace, has lapsed. And that's true. It's lapsed for the very first time in the FCC's history of having this auction authority. Again, the mechanism by which we move spectrum out. And I agree that we need Congress to reauthorize our spectrum auction authority, but it's sort of a chicken and the egg. When the FCC itself is not articulating and telling Congress, if you give us this authority, here are the specific spectrum bands we're going to move, then I don't think Congress really gets the urgency. That's why I think it's important for this agency to take the plan that I laid out in March of 2021, or a different one, and lay out concrete steps, concrete spectrum bands that we would move if we were to get our auction authority back. And then maybe that makes Congress move a bit faster. But if we're not telling Congress, here's our plan, then I don't think Congress gets a sense of urgency.
And if sorry.
Go ahead. There's a lot in there. Go ahead.
And just zooming out on the global aspect of your question, Shane. So for those who mercifully are uninitiated, every 4 years, there's what is called the World Radio Communication Conference, which is essentially the International Telecommunications Union, a branch of the United Nations, holds. And it's essentially like your Model UN applied to spectrum, where every country comes together with a delegation as a member state. And they essentially try to push policies that those particular countries would prefer in terms of spectrum policy. And the reason that's important is, to the extent that a particular policy is ratified or agreed to by a large number, or ideally all countries, then you essentially have a spectrum band that everybody agrees on, and then equipment manufacturers, innovators can innovate around that. And so to your point about global harmonization, that's really, really important, because if the United States prefers X, but the rest of the world prefers not X, even though we're obviously a large country, we're not so large that everybody's going to pour capital and really innovate in that particular spectrum band. And so one of the things that I did when I was helping to lead with the 2019 version of the World Radio Communication Conference is work with my colleagues at the State Department, the White House, et cetera, to make sure that we went into that conference with a very concrete set of bands that we wanted to advance the ball in. And we were largely successful in that. I think part of the problem that Commissioner Carr is identifying is when you limp into the World Radio Communication Conference with a strategy that really doesn't identify any particular goals or bands or timeframes, you're essentially throwing the decision-making responsibility to other countries like China, which have a very defined view on where they want spectrum policy to go. And so, as I said earlier this week when I read the strategy, we've now essentially relegated ourselves to the back seat when it comes to driving global wireless innovation, because at the World Radio Communication Conference and thereafter, we're essentially going to be hoping, fingers crossed, that the bands that we identify domestically are going to be bands that are going to be innovated around globally. And that's not a good position to be in. And the other point I would raise is, we are obviously talking prospectively about the lack of a strategy, but this is underscored by the fact that retrospectively, over the last 3 years, we haven't seen much action at all. In fact, there's not a single spectrum auction that the current FCC started after January 2021. Every single spectrum auction they held is one that we started, the C-band, of course, and the 2.5 gigahertz band. And in fact, as Commissioner Carr adverted to, we're actually moving backwards. In addition to the 2.5 gigahertz licenses that, in my view and the view of general counsels of both parties, the agency is sitting on inappropriately, we're also moving backward on the 4.9 gigahertz band, the Legato L band spectrum, which we took a lot of effort to get across the finish line before I left office, is now in limbo. And it's just unfortunate because stasis is not where you want to be in a fast moving marketplace like this. You want to give innovators and entrepreneurs the building blocks to be able to do what they do best. And if it's not there, then they'll simply go to other countries and see if they can innovate there.
You brought up something that I think is important, because speaking about spectrum, first of all, it amazes me because we can't see it, and it does all this amazing stuff, and it allows us to have so much of our own digital economy. But the idea of the equipment manufacturers is one I think people can physically latch onto. They get the idea that if we are not in step with how everyone else wants to use these bands, there'll be a little market for the US space, and there'll be a gigantic market for everybody who moves forward in that area. So we'll end up not only falling behind in ways of policy, but you actually will have devices that will not be as functional as those that will be around the globe. I always think about it when you think about how we're still on all these different measurements for travel, when you're like, okay, which plug do I need? And we should be so beyond that, but we're not, right? And from a digital element, we have been, but we're actually looking at a situation right now where we could fall behind and no longer be cutting edge in the innovation space in this area. And spectrum plays a really big part in that. So I really appreciate you bringing that part up.
And that's why Commissioner Carr's point about the need for a spectrum pipeline or calendar is so very important. And if I might, one of the very prescient commissioners back in 2018 said, it's time for transparency. The FCC needs to publish a calendar that lets our wireless economy plan for the future by describing just what spectrum bands will be auctioned and when. This is simple. There's no good reason not to do it. Well, that commissioner is now leading the agency. And I think it's even more important now than it was 5 years ago, given that we aren't doing anything on spectrum policy for the agency, for the entire executive branch, to identify bands with clarity, because otherwise, as Commissioner Carr mentioned, we're going to be further and further behind, and countries like China, which have a very defined view and have spectrum assets in the pipeline, are going to be the ones to seize the mantle of 5G and even 6G leadership. And we don't want that.
So what?
I think one of the things that when people look at sort of 5G, I think one thing to keep in mind, again, is we're taking so much more traffic now on these networks than ever before. And had we not made this transition to 5G, we wouldn't be in the situation we were. Just look at COVID, right? During COVID-19, network traffic spiked globally something like 30% overnight. And to put that in perspective, 30% is about the expected traffic growth that engineers expect over the course of a year. So we took a year's worth of traffic growth and stuck it on the network overnight. And what happened? In Europe, their regulators were worried that the continent's networks would break. They actually called up Netflix and asked them to throttle or down res their streams because they didn't have the capacity. We didn't have to do that here. Why? Because we've been freeing up massive amounts of spectrum to deal with that capacity. In fact, during COVID, speeds on mobile networks in the US actually increased. And in fact, right now, because of this capacity that we have, this additional spectrum, again, it's not just about innovation, which it is, and it's not just about global leadership, which it is, but just everyday life for consumers. Right now, it's sort of surprising, if you had said this a couple of years ago, the entities, the companies that are taking the largest market share currently of the in-home broadband market, a market that historically was dominated by cable or maybe a fiber provider, are traditional mobile wireless carriers. And the reason why is they have the spectrum capacity to deliver this technology, either 5G or fixed wireless, to give people more choice. And if we don't have spectrum, we cannot do that type of competition. So it's good for competition, which drives down prices. It gives consumer choices. So there's so many reasons why America leading on wireless is vital. We got to get back to hitting our stride on this. Again, the Biden administration's spectrum plan, I'll say two things on it. One, it targets 2,800 megahertz for study, again, study alone over the course of the next 2 years, which will conveniently kick it past the election. So no real need to deliver in the near term, apparently. But 2,800 may sound like a lot to the uninitiated. But again, think back when the chairman was the chairman, we delivered on over 6,000 megahertz. They're only studying a fraction of what was actually delivered from 2017 to 2020. And the 6,000 is only licensed. There were thousands and thousands of additional megahertz above and beyond that that we made available for unlicensed use as well. And the challenge is not one that's new to the Biden administration. We saw it in the Trump years as well. Again, it goes back to this idea that federal agencies have their own mission that require wireless connectivity, and they're laser focused on that. And God bless them, they do important stuff, and they should be focused on their missions. And trying to find a way to work collaboratively with them is difficult. But Congress made a decision in the Communications Act. And what it decided there was it wanted to vest the authority to ultimately make these decisions about the best allocation of spectrum between government and private sector, licensed and unlicensed, in a single expert agency, the FCC. But what we've seen over the last couple of years is something that I sort of describe as spectrum golem, where you've got all of these federal agencies that understand the value of spectrum, the brass ring in the analogy, and they have been attempting to circumvent the process that Congress laid out, which was for an independent agency to call balls and strikes. And once we make a decision about how spectrum should be allocated, the music stops and we have to move on. And we haven't seen that the last couple of years. And again, not just this administration. Agencies are sort of collaterally attacking FCC decisions. Members of Congress will put, holds on different things that we can do. In one of the things we have to do in addition to a spectrum plan that includes spectrum is to get back to this recognition that it is the FCC that calls balls and strikes. And right now we're sort of getting Plutoed in this process, and the FCC needs to step up with some leadership. And, there were some steps that the Biden spectrum plan made in this vein in terms of trying to get back to a place where all these other agencies would go through the Commerce Department as a single point. And that's good. What the plan also said was if any agency is sort of aggrieved and doesn't agree, they can elevate this to the president directly as a sort of matter of last resort. But again, that gets away from the entire reason why Congress set up an agency outside of the executive branch, which is they didn't want sort of, narrow, short-term electoral political considerations to get undue weight in this decision-making process. So we have to get back to a point where the FCC itself and the chair of the FCC is looked at as leading the country on spectrum and get proper deference from other agencies and from the White House itself. And again, that's a process issue that some progress was made, but frankly, leaving it to the president at the end of the day, I don't think is where we need to end up. So I think that's part of the problem is that process. But again, we just have to find a way to push through because, again, when Ajit was chair, DOD pushed back hard on this L-band spectrum. We moved forward nonetheless. DOT pushed back hard on 5.9. We moved forward nonetheless. NOAA, to the extent they can push. NOAA pushed back hard on 24, 28 gigahertz. We move forward nonetheless. And this sort of spectrum NIMBYism that we've seen from other agencies really needs some strong leadership, someone with political capital that can get the deal done. And that's where we got to get back to.
So I am a supporter of the Department of Defense, but I think that Ajit, you brought up a very good point earlier.
The DOD has like aircraft carriers. I'm also a big fan of DOD. DOD's out there, big fan.
So here's my question is, you always get this problem with national security and transparency, right? Like you're trying to figure out, so again, physical analogy of, I think of it as like real estate, right? Like you might have this gigantic parking garage that made sense when we weren't so urbanized. And now all of a sudden it's in the middle of a bunch of really tall buildings and there's a better use for that space. But in the commercial market, you can see it, right? In the commercial market, you can say, let's take that down. We can put something else there that'll make more sense. We'll figure out, there's fewer cars parked. DOD just basically says, like, puts a scrim up and says, all ours, go away. That's kind of the way it feels. I mean, I'm sure there's more words used in that, but in my world, that's what it feels like they're saying. So how do we get around that?
I think the key, the key is honestly, as Commissioner Carr was mentioning, just FCC leadership. That you have to be able to keep chiseling away and making the case, both publicly and internally within the entire executive branch. Publicly, I think the record speaks for itself that we really pushed hard on areas where we thought the science and engineering was behind us. We mentioned Legato and the L-band. What has happened to that company is an absolute travesty, given that we created a guard band separating GPS, which the DoD was concerned about, with Legato's L-band operations. Nonetheless, the DoD refused to essentially comply with the science-based order and is now relitigating it through the Congress and ultimately through the FCC. There are other agencies as well. One of the biggest travesties, to me at least, was the C-band, where we had studied the record very, very carefully. We auctioned off the spectrum, the largest spectrum auction in American history, generated some 81 or 93 all in $billion for the US Treasury, freed up a lot of prime mid-band spectrum for 5G for the benefit of consumers. And after the fact, the FAA, at the behest of the airline industry, comes in and says, well, the C-band spectrum, even though it's several hundred megahertz away, is going to interfere with altimeters that are in commercial aviation, and planes are going to fall out of the sky, notwithstanding the fact that countries from France and Japan already use this spectrum. And you don't see Air France or Air Japan flights, collapsing as a result of that. And, it's very unfortunate that on this particular issue, the official who was most prominent in making the case wasn't the FCC or even the White House. It was Secretary Buttigieg at the Department of Transportation, who was arguing that we needed to pause the deployment of this spectrum by the companies that had bid at auction for it. And he was the one making the case, which was doubly ironic, not just because the DOT is not the spectrum expert, as Commissioner Carr mentioned, the FCC is, but also because when he was Mayor Pete campaigning, he was actually the one presidential candidate who explicitly campaigned on freeing up the C-band for commercial use. And so to me, on all of these different spectrum bands, I think what is critical is to focus on the facts and focus on the law. The facts consistently showed that the FCC makes expert decisions. It wasn't just me or Commissioner Carr. I mean, these are career servants in the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, who are supporting the factual foundation for the work that we did. And legally speaking, again, the FCC has the authority here. And to the extent the FCC does disagree with other federal agencies, which does happen, then it becomes incumbent on the FCC to escalate it to the appropriate person at the White House. During my time there, was typically the National Economic Council with occasional input from the National Security Council. But this White House might be very different. But the point is, there has to be a mechanism and the willingness to use that mechanism in order to resolve these disputes and do so promptly. And so I think one of the unfortunate things about the spectrum strategy, in addition to saying, okay, we're just going to study this for a couple of years, which is a very convenient data point time frame, is that it essentially gives a pass to all those federal agencies and says, okay, we're going to wave the white flag in terms of commercial spectrum, because all you have to do is simply say, I object, like a single senator can on the Senate floor. And that essentially dooms any given spectrum band to purgatory for the time being. And so that's not a recipe for success for wireless innovation. And, look, I have the gray hair, and Commissioner Carr does too, to show for the battles that we waged on this issue. But, nonetheless, I think the beneficiaries are American consumers who enjoy faster, better, cheaper wireless services as a result of those efforts.
So does auction authority being held up play into that?
I don't think it does at all. In fact, if anything, the fact that the FCC hasn't even commenced any spectrum proceedings since January 2021 takes away the urgency for Congress to take any action. I think a member of Congress might rightly ask, Republican or Democrat, why is this an urgent issue for us to address if the agency, if the White House, if other entities in the executive branch don't even have a pipeline or a time frame for suggesting that they're going to exercise that authority. And moreover, on the 2.5 gigahertz licenses, the authority they did have to hold auctions it's not being followed through. They're not actually granting licenses. And so, of course, I support the FCC having spectrum auction authority. I think most reasonable people think that Ronald Coase got it right in that seminal 1959 paper about the importance of allocating this public resource through the auction mechanism. But I think it's going to be important for the FCC to start putting plans on paper, and for the entire executive branch to say, this is what we're going to do, instead of just kicking the can down the road for another 2 years. I guess the question I would ask is to those who believe that spectrum auction authority is urgent, I would say, well, what makes you think that? If you're a legislator and you don't see anything on the horizon for the next 2 years, at the very least, why don't we just focus other more pressing topics like tax or immigration or foreign policy?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Again, I think, if the FCC were to put out, a concrete spectrum plan, a spectrum calendar, I think that would go a long way in terms of encouraging Congress to revisit and to reauthorize our spectrum authority. But frankly, I think this is another one where I'd like to see the industry doing a little bit better job of even advocating for itself. I mean, I'm up here advocating because I think this is the best interest of America's national security interests. It's in the best interest of American consumers. But I think industry needs to do a little better job too. There was a lot of applauding of the Biden administration spectrum strategy that came out on Monday. I think that sends all the wrong signals. I mean, I understand it's difficult to sort of tell the truth to the government, but this is one where, really the emperor has no clothes. The spectrum plan had no spectrum in it at a point in time in which we are falling behind China. We're almost 400 megahertz behind almost every other country when it comes to this type of stuff. We need to start speaking with truth and with clarity and say that was a miss. We need to find a way to quickly correct course. So I think it's incumbent on everybody to start being honest with this national spectrum strategy. Again, this isn't easy. The agencies are pushing back. I get that. But we got to at least be honest about where we are if we're going to work our way out of this hole.
Oh, and Shane, the other point I should mention as well is that we were obviously talking primarily about spectrum auctions, which implies licensed spectrum. We're selling the right to use the public airwaves to a particular entity or entities. But there's also unlicensed spectrum, which is really important as well. Most consumers, including me right now, and maybe you too, are using Wi-Fi in order to connect to the internet. And so there too, I think it's important for the FCC to show leadership in terms of pushing ahead with some of that unlicensed wireless innovation that's enabled us to do things which were previously thought unthinkable. And one of the unfortunate things with the 6 gigahertz band, which we pushed across the finish line during my time there, is that it took almost 3 years for the agency to take the next step with respect to so-called very low power applications, really, really low power, almost narrowband types of applications that consumers could use using these Wi-Fi airwaves. And so there too, it's important for the agency to set a marker that, these are public airwaves at the end of the day. And the goal of the FCC and the goal of the entire federal government should be to maximize the benefit of those for the public, for the wireless public.
Yeah, the 6 gigahertz band is actually an interesting case study. So a lot of people sort of like, Wi-Fi, and they like all these devices to work in their home. And historically, we had relatively little spectrum for that, the 2 gigahertz band, the 5 gigahertz band. And one of the things that Chairman Pai did was he opened up 1,200 megahertz of spectrum in 6 gigahertz. I think depending on how you count it, it was something like 3 to 5 times increase in the amount of unlicensed spectrum that had been available. In fact, consumers today are buying all these new Wi-Fi devices in their homes that are operating these 1,200 megahertz of spectrum. And it was a good win. And it was a win that required setting up in some cases to industry, in some cases to government entities and agencies as well. But there's more that we can do. As the chairman noted, there's been a request for us to move on VLP, which is called very low power devices, but it's basically authorizing some more devices to operate in that band, potentially increase the power for what we call low power devices. And so those are ones that, again, have nothing to do with our auction authority, are ones that we are free and clear to move on. And we need to, because when we moved on 6 gigahertz, I think it was maybe April of 2020, when the chairman did it, we were the first country. We're the first country in the world to move quickly on 6 gigahertz and open it up. And then flash forward to when we took an additional small action on 6 gigahertz a month or two ago. I think we were something like the 51st country to take that action. So we went from being the first mover in 6 to the follow-up action being the 51st country, give or take, on 6. And I just think that's sort of an interesting case study for where we are. Now, China, again, on 6, they have their own goals. They want to unwind that April 2020 FCC decision and make it licensed spectrum. I love licensed spectrum, just not going to do it in 6, in my view. So China's looking to go backwards there. So again, that's another place where we're playing defense on, but I hope we win that defensive battle there.
So just to play devil's advocate, what if they are being more innovative and they're saying there's a better use for this particular level of spectrum? Would we revisit our thoughts on that?
I don't think we should. In my view, the door is closed. I'm not going backwards on the decision that we made in April 2020 to open up for unlicensed use. If someone feels, and I agree, that we need more licensed mid-band spectrum, then I think you look at 6 and say, okay, if I'm a licensed guy, I lost that one. I'm going to use that to say, but now you really have to deliver for me in lower 3 or in 4 gigahertz or something like that. And so that's how I would think about it. And they're right. But again, as we go into those battles with China on 6 gigahertz in work, I would prefer that we do so with a bit of a stronger position, meaning that we had identified lower 3 or 4 or 7, 8 other spectrum bands to be playing some offense on.
So what role is Congress playing in this? So I know that, the Commerce Committee is basically your bread and butter. It's where I spend a lot of time, and they spent a bit of time this summer trying to get the spectrum auction reauthorization put together, and it just seemed like they couldn't get traction for multiple reasons. But of course, at one point we didn't have a speaker for a couple of weeks or 10 days. So
painful time. Let's not revisit it. Painful time. It's too soon.
I was with another country's leadership, and then they said, it's okay, we don't have a speaker right now too. And I was like, I just don't like the fact that we're being compared to. Yeah. So, so going into this election cycle in 2024 it's a tough time to get Congress to focus on anything other than reelection. But what is it that we need to be looking at 2024 to hopefully get some more wins in our categories? We have a lot of challenges, as you guys have just pointed out, on the landscape here. So what are we focusing on in 2024? What's ideal?
Yeah, there's a lot to be done. Ted Cruz and his team, he's the ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee. They've been doing just some great work on spectrum and a lot of other issues in telecom. On the House side, Catherine Rogers is the chair there. She's been doing some good work on spectrum as well. So I do think we have to continue to work, but things get more difficult, more challenging. But again, the predicate first step is, let's get together with the commission. Let's tell Congress, here's what we would do on day 1 of our auction authority. Here's what we do on day 2 of our auction authority. And that, I think, would be the biggest short-term boost to getting some leadership. And I know we're focused on spectrum, but there's also infrastructure, right? It's always a two-piece component to U.S. leadership in wireless. And, look at permitting reform. It's just going nowhere right now. I was just in Montana a couple months ago now on a visit a small wireless provider. I think it might have been Union Wireless. And I walked through their warehouse and then outside of their laydown yard, and they had something like 90 antenna cell site components just sitting there in their laydown yard waiting to get built out, but they didn't have the federal permits that they needed. So we have to get going on infrastructure reform again. Chairman Pai, when he was chairman, he very wisely tapped me to lead some of the infrastructure efforts, and we put up a lot of W's on that, and we got to sort of get back to that again.
So moving over to infrastructure. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Ajit.
Oh, no, I would agree with that. And, the other thing I would say is that I think to the extent that the FCC, to the extent that the White House suggested there is a pipeline, that there is a sort of an impetus for Congress to get moving. I mean, this is one of the issues that should be relatively immune from some of the political vicissitudes of the day. I mean, after all, Spectrum Auction Authority has been broadly embraced by both parties. This is one of the few revenue raisers for the federal government. And given our unfortunate fiscal situation, of course, we need all the revenue raisers we can get. And of course, the bottom line is that these public airwaves do generate a lot of value for American consumers. So, obviously, it's an election year. Things are going to be bogged down, given the politics of the day. But nonetheless, this is one of the areas where I would hope that the FCC and the White House would prod Congress to say, look, let's take some bipartisan action here and get a win for the American people.
So you mentioned infrastructure, and that has been a huge focus for a lot of people the last couple of years. And that itself has its own pipeline, it really kind of a supply chain. And you mentioned equipment on the ground kind of breaks my heart, because we know that we have workforce challenges, we have equipment challenges. I love, you and me are together on a plan. I have a feeling, though, that you have a kid in the back of the car that's hearing about that plan all the time. You're like, do you have a plan? You can't be scoring, goals here unless we know what we're doing. So the absence of a plan, no plan, means we just sort of meander around and hope it goes well, which doesn't usually work. But so the idea of, what we're doing to encourage workforce and equipment. I know NTIA has a lot of the lead on this with the BEAD program, but GAO came out with a study saying there's 133 programs for potential broadband, across America. What are we winning there? Is it getting better? I know the states are putting their plans into finality, hopefully this around Christmas. Are we seeing?
Look, you're right. There's a lot of different infrastructure and broadband, broadly speaking, initiatives that are going on around. You noted the GAO report. Again, it's something like 130 programs spread across a dozen plus agencies right now. And as GAO pointed out, there's no national coordinating strategy. I've called for it. It hasn't happened. And if you step back, we're spending something, by my count, like $800 billion that have been made available that could be used on broadband initiatives. Won't all be used on it. Could be other infrastructure initiatives that could be used on broadband infrastructure. We're putting all of this money into the system, and we have no coordination across all of them. That's like, turning a hose on full blast and then walking away from the spigot. it's really not going to work out well. So we need to find a way to put a national coordinating strategy in place. And with the Biden administration's signature Internet for All initiative, BEAD, this is the sort of $65 billion initiative that was included in the 2021 Infrastructure Act. I'm very concerned about the future of that program. I mean, look, no one wants that thing to succeed and connect every single American more than me, or frankly, equally anybody, particularly people that are in government service right now with this on their agenda. But I'm concerned, and I've put out a lot of statements on this, that there's been the elevation of extraneous political goals at the expense of actually just turning dirt and connecting Americans. And so, yeah, I think a coordinating strategy would help. And I think just zeroing in on what is it going to take to connect people rather than pursuing political goals would put us in better stead.
I would add to that. I mean, I think the two are actually generally symbiotic to the extent that most wireless traffic ultimately ends up on wires, much more than over the airwaves. And to the extent that we can get the workforce development right, that means that these fiber-based networks, predominantly fiber-based networks that were going to be deployed through the BEAD program, could be used for wireless backhaul in more parts of the country that today don't have the benefit of 5G. And so here too, as Commissioner Carr was mentioning, spectrum and infrastructure are almost two sides of the connectivity coin. And so it's really important for us to get everything right on the public subsidy for fixed broadband deployment side in order to make sure that we benefit from next generation wireless services. So these are by no means siloed. The other thing I'd point out is that there are some really interesting initiatives in the private sector to help solve this problem. The Wireless Infrastructure Association years ago, under the leadership of former Commissioner Jonathan Adelstein, set up a workforce initiative. There are others as well that are on the federal level. And on state-based levels, one of the things I'm seeing in my own private sector work is that there are different entities, some of which, for example, focus on veterans who are coming out of the armed services and sort of training them for these jobs, both wireless and fiber deployment and the like. And so hopefully, as Commissioner Carr said, there can be sort of a more overarching national strategy to help leverage the energy that is out there, but is kind of fragmented at the moment, to make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction.
My colleague Mark Jameson wrote a piece that's in Tech Policy Daily today that I was not paying as much attention to. Apparently, you had a big discussion about diversity over at the agency the other day. His quote is, "New rules regulate not only broadband providers, but also contractors and other unspecified entities involved in broadband access. This open-ended reach means that some companies will be surprised one day to find that the FCC and at their doors accusing them of violating regulations that they didn't even know existed." So is this going to be another layer of challenge of trying to get everyone wired up, as we've got all these complexities and hidden agendas that are in this system as well now?
Yeah, look, there's no question that this latest FCC decision, which we voted on here 2 days ago, is going to be nothing but a serious headwind against the effort to get all Americans connected. Again, this goes back to the 2021 infrastructure law. That was a 1,000+ page bill, and tucked, I think, somewhere on page 836 was a one-page provision on digital equity. And I think a lot of lobbyists looked at the draft of that legislation when it was working its way through, and they thought it was either largely hortatory or at least forward-looking. And it just said, listen, if you're building out broadband in this country, you should not be discriminating, refusing to serve someone or a community based on religion, national origin, that type of stuff. And it makes total sense to both have that. It would be additive, or maybe even a little overlap, but at least additive of existing civil rights law. That's a good thing. We should make sure that providers are not intentionally discriminating in their bills. And the FCC was proceeding with this review of that statute and to implement it. And there's lots of reasonable ways that the FCC could have addressed that narrow statute, addressed rules that really would have made a difference in connecting Americans. But at the last minute, the Biden administration pulled Leroy Jenkins and filed comments telling us that we should adopt this extreme position on digital equity. And the proceedings sort of went off the rails from there. And we adopted this order earlier this week that sweeps in entire industries into the FCC's jurisdiction that have never, in the 90-year history of the agency, ever been regulated. And that is not at all what Congress did in a one-page statute. Again, there's a term of statutory interpretation that Congress doesn't hide in mouse holes. And here, somehow we found an entire herd of elements in there. So as you noted out, contractors, construction workers, CWA, unions, conduct that's contrary to digital equity, cities, all of those are going to be subject to the FCC's jurisdiction and, importantly, second guessing for a long time coming. And it's every single decision as well. Every decision from the C-suite all the way down to the call center of a company is now subject to veto from the FCC. And listen, my view is we should have internet infrastructure in this country that is not able to be canceled by the federal government. And this heads in the opposite direction. We have just never, ever, ever, as an agency, let alone a government, had this degree of power and authority over the actual internet infrastructure itself, where it can be built, who gets service, the speeds, the quality, the pricing, the discounts that consumers get. Again, none of that was in that little narrow one-page provision of law. And here's what's so telling. At the very last minute, a couple of hours before the FCC voted on that decision, the Biden administration secured one last victory. It exempted itself from those very digital equity rules that they wanted applied to everybody else. Again, it goes back to BEAD, Internet for All. They are using that BEAD initiative to subsidize ISPs, and through those subsidies, direct where it's built and where it's not built. And the Biden administration was worried that should they be held to that same digital equity standard in terms of discriminating, that they could be liable under the FCC's rules. And so they secured for themselves an exclusion. And frankly, that gives away the ballgame, right? It's plainly not about preventing discrimination. If it was, why would the Biden administration want to discriminate? It's not about promoting digital equity, because if it was, does the Biden administration not want to promote digital equity? And it really sort of just collapsed the whole thing. And the truth is, it's plain to everybody. That was just a proceeding about getting more and more government control. And look, I get it. People don't love their cable company. I don't think that's ever going to change. But what's happening right now is the administration is telling you that because you don't like your cable company, trust us, trust the government to start making these decisions for you. And this isn't an isolated pinprick, right? We did this last month. We had this vote to move back towards Title II, utility-style regulation of the internet, government control. You see it across all of the Biden administration's approach to internet policy, whether it's jawboning social media companies to get them to silence political speech they disagree with. So I think the through line there is government control. I think it's a mistake. My colleagues and I work really, really well together at FCC. We get a lot of good things done. We obviously just didn't see eye to eye on this one. Again, I do think that there was a narrow and appropriate way that we could have implemented that statute. But the way that we did is going to create a headwinds. And the proof is in the fact that the one broadband initiative that the administration really wants to see succeed, their BEAD, they carved out from the whole program.
Any thoughts on that?
I think Commissioner Carr had a very strongly worded dissent where he outlined a lot of his views. And certainly on the legal side, he's a far better lawyer than I am. But based on my reading of his statement and a few others, it does seem that a disparate impact analysis historically has not fared well in the Supreme Court. And of course, there's the major questions doctrine that might be a substantial obstacle in that particular proceeding. The only thing I'll say is, look, I've now been in the private sector almost 3 years since leaving the FCC in January 2021. And I can tell you the companies I work with, large and small, they are singularly focused on broadening the reach of their networks. And they are not in any way whatsoever looking at any types of, there's no discriminatory intent whatsoever in the decisions that they make. They want to connect as many, these are mission-oriented organizations that really want to connect more people across the country with better infrastructure and better services. And so, it's the disjunction between some of the, I guess what you might call the more political debate at the FCC or in Washington on this issue, as opposed to the lived reality of millions of broadband consumers across the country who are getting better services almost every day. It's just very, very stark. And so I would simply hope that on any given issue, the FCC would take a look at exactly what is happening in the marketplace, as opposed to you putting a finger in the wind and thinking, okay, this particular political constituency wants us to go in this direction. And so we're going to rush in that direction, regardless of the facts on the ground.
Is that Ginger who's upset about this too in the background?
Yeah, there's I think a bulldog in the household might not be all that happy. Not about this particular issue, but you never know. She might have strongly held views on this as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Guys, I'm gonna start looking at the questions. Go ahead, and I will just take a peek. Go ahead. Please speak. What were you gonna say?
Yeah, no, I was just saying, look, again, obviously, all of us share the very same goal, which is to make sure we have absolutely every single American connected. And that's why I had and have high hopes that this $65 billion BEAD program does, in fact, deliver on its promise, because we can't afford to leave Americans behind, and we have the money sort of for the first time ever to do that. And so I do want to see a little bit of a course correction that we can get these wins.
Great. So we have a question from Paul Kirby at TR Daily.
Never heard of him.
Hi, Paul. If there are people that have questions, you can go to the now X, formerly known as Twitter, at AEI Tech, and you can put questions in, and Kate will put them in the queue here. So Paul Kirby asked, I think this is to you, Commissioner Carr, you criticize the fact that the Biden plan doesn't allocate any actual spectrum, instead lays out a plan to study the bands. However, the Trump administration never completed the spectrum plan that it promised. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, it's simply not true. So the spectrum plan that we had during the last administration was called the 5G Fast Plan. And it was a plan that delivered over 6,000 megahertz of actual spectrum into the actual marketplace. So the apples comparison is 6,000 megahertz licensed plus thousands of additional megahertz unlicensed made available compared to studying 2,800. So when you line it up plan for plan, there not only was a plan, but more importantly, there was spectrum there.
And even to the extent that the prior administration did not publish a document called National Spectrum Strategy, if you look at the current one that was advanced earlier this week, the singular message that comes out of that is, we will try. But to borrow from Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back, when Luke says, okay, I'll try to get the X-Wing fighter out of the swamp, Yoda appropriately says, try not, do, or do not. There is no try. We did. Yeah. And that the proof is in the pudding, as Commissioner Carr mentioned, 6,000 megahertz auctioned, in addition to approximately 5,000 of megahertz of Wi-Fi. I mean, I think at the end of the day, consumers care a lot more about the fact that we did, as opposed to having a glossy PDF that says we tried.
The chairman not here at the agency anymore. I can tell you that the number of pop culture references is just at an all-time low around here. We really got to bring some of that back.
It isn't just references, it's full quotes from Star Wars. I mean, it's really impressive, because I just get a snippet of that, and my people here say that a lot. All right, we have a question from Jeff Wessling that both panelists argue for the FCC leadership with regards to NTIA and the White House. Do we need any formal legislative changes, or is this just a willingness to take the fight? Also, will failing to specify bans for reallocation have a disparate impact on low-income consumers?
Yeah, a couple things here. Go ahead.
No. Well, I'll simply take the first. I mean, look, no legislation is necessary. It simply requires the FCC, in some cases, to lead with its chin. And look, on every one of these bans, I mean, you could see all these heralds of doom when we were pushing ahead on 24 gigahertz. It's going to be the end of weather forecasting, 5.9 gigahertz DSRC. 36,000 more people are going to die on the roads because of this. Legato, GPS is going to fail. C-band, altimeters are going to fail, and planes are going to fall out of the sky. And it requires the FCC to simply say, no, we're going to keep pushing ahead based on the facts, in some cases, to leverage the White House to make sure that our equities are represented in the highest reaches of the executive branch. I mean, there's part of the reason why we did a 5G summit with the president back in 2019, I think it was to emphasize that for the United States to maintain leadership in 5G and for consumers to benefit from wireless innovation, we need to make sure that it's not just the FCC, an independent agency, speaking, but it's the entire executive branch represented in the person of the president speaking. And that was a really important event that it didn't get a lot of coverage, but I think it underlined that our focus is going to be on making sure we pushed ahead. And so, more legislation, sure, great if you want it, but you don't need it. What really is required is just the desire to take on these fights. And it's all too easy to kick the can down the road and say it's going to be my successor's problem, but that's not a recipe for success. You're not going to produce a lot of results that way. You might produce some very nice press releases and the like from those who just want to maintain the status quo, but you're not going to get results that way. Sorry, go ahead, Commissioner Carr.
Yeah, I should say, look, at the end of the day, it takes the accumulation of political capital and the willingness to spend it. And Chairman Powell was great at that. I mean, but there are ways you can sort of, I guess, substitute for it a little bit. Having the White House itself express more clearly its desire for more spectrum, we're just not seeing that. There's a big focus in this particular White House on fiber and connecting that, and that's great. We should have well in the high 90% of this country connected by fiber, I'm all for it. But we need to leave room as well for fixed wireless, for 5G, for this new generation of low Earth orbit satellites. And I just think, on the relative balance of all tools but should be made available, the White House is just really very focused on wired fiber. And I think that's why you see this sort of slowdown in spectrum. Really, at its core, I think everything else you can trace from the failure of this White House to emphasize it. There's other people that have attempted to make some efforts to bolster the standing, the political capital of NTIA, which is the component of Commerce that deals with spectrum. There's been some ideas of you elevate the NTIA to a higher level within the Commerce Department. Could that help? Again, those are all sort of proxies for trying to have people that care about spectrum policy have political capital that they could then spend in these fights. Again, if the chairman sort of indicated, I don't know if there's more to indicate or not, but he would have to go to the White House and go up against secretaries of defense, the heads of the National Economic Council. He'd be in the room, making the case as to why this spectrum ban right here, right now, is the right one to do.
And the second question, which was important as well with respect to low-income consumers, I mean, this is not an academic issue. The studies consistently show that lower-income consumers disproportionately tend to rely solely on wireless for their connection to the internet. And so to the extent that the spectrum pipeline is more and more constricted, that wireless innovation is slowed down, ultimately that's going to redound more to the detriment of low-income consumers as opposed to those who might be able to afford more expensive cellular, but more importantly, can also afford fixed broadband at home, which is like fiber or cable, for example.
Great point. We have a question from Richard Bennett. He says the administration's spectrum strategy is off to a bad start. Should the NTIA effort be suspended and a new national broadband plan like their project started under the FCC leadership?
I mean, on this issue, I've become a little bit more skeptical after leaving government. At the end of the day, people are going to recognize what you do, not what you say or what you print or what you tweet or what you write. And so however they end up doing it, just get it done. That's ultimately what is going to make a mark. And so, look, I don't necessarily disagree with the spectrum bands that were identified in the strategy, but I think it was critical is just moving on this stuff. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's what I would say is that we need results, and whether that comes in the form of suspending the strategy and moving on to something else, or maintaining the strategy but simply converting it from study into doing, I would defer to others. I think it's just we need to end this sort of public choice problem of it's somebody else's problem, and just sort of take agency of it and just start doing.
Commissioner Carr, any thoughts on that? Okay. Phil Kirpins asks, does the experience of the last few years make the case for changing the structure of the commission to a permanent and equal partisan split?
Well, it's a good question. If you look at what we did during the first 2 years of the Biden administration, I thought it was actually pretty interesting. We were 2-2. As I always said at the time, that was the second best thing to being in the majority, was being in sort of the equanimity. I don't know what the right descriptor that was, but if you look at what we did during that period of time, we didn't go to our corners. We didn't, Republicans, shut down the agency because we didn't have the gavel. I worked closely with the chair. We found common ground. We got a lot of smart, common sense things done. I think we're going to continue to do some of that, but there's obviously been this introduction now that we're 3-2 back to some of these partisan things. I think it goes back to, frankly, the major questions doctrine, which is how do we get back to a world in which Congress is the one legislating and engaging in the legislative power? When you have the absence of the major questions doctrine and an expansive reading of Chevron, it actually puts people in Congress into their corners because there's no reason to compromise. Why compromise on, say, Title II if what you can do is sit back and let the agency just reinterpret a 1934 statute to be something entirely different? So I think the Supreme Court is on the right track with the major questions doctrine. People say, well, Congress isn't getting anything done, so therefore you must do something, FCC. Well, obviously, Congress not getting something done does not vest us with authority, but it also reverses things. If we actually just stayed within our lane, did our knitting, it would force Congress to do its job and come to the middle. And I think that would be a good thing. So I'm open to some ideas of structural changes. Frankly, I sort of think 3 commissioners, I've said before, might be better than 5. I think the dynamics maybe work a little bit better that way towards compromise and middle ground. But yeah, it's an interesting idea.
All right. And I have a question from Nathan Leamer. It says, in your experience, how should different agencies and the executive branch coordinate and collaborate to put a united front when negotiating various topics, such as these spectrum standards, against adversarial nations such as China or Russia?
I would encourage Nathan to push the rewind button and watch the last hour. I do think that we covered that fairly well. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Look, we need to come together and speak very clearly on spectrum. Again, that's why it's so important that we put out a national spectrum strategy that has actual spectrum there, because I think that's what's going to help give the U.S. standing as we head into Dubai, where this World Radio Conference is. But happy for the chairman to weigh in as well on these issues.
Yeah, I can't really add anything more to what Commissioner Carr said or what we said earlier, but simply making sure that there's a coherent and consistent effort to coordinate messaging in advance of the WRC, so that we're not sort of flying by the seat of our pants going into November. That's absolutely critical. I mean, I don't know. Again, a lot of people might not be familiar with this, but in the 2 or so years leading up to, or 3 years leading up to a WRC, there are a lot of opportunities for the U.S. government to get its message coherent within the U.S. government, but also to get other countries and other regions on our side. For example, there are Latin American conferences or Central Asian conferences or African conferences where we can pitch our message, but to do that, we have to have a message that's decided upon well in advance and that we advance on a uniform basis. And so historically, what has happened is that the U.S. government can't come to a considered view until late in the game, and then we end up playing catch up at some of these conferences. And so anyway, I would like to see if we're going to maintain this WRC framework. There have been some arguments that we should just do our own thing with other like-minded countries around the world. To the extent we work through the WRC, it would be better to, again, come to a consistent U.S. government view early and then start pitching that in bilateral and multilateral fora as aggressively and as promptly as we can.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, thank you for all the work you have done, and thank you for all the work you plan to do, and thank you for your time today. So we are at time, and I know you've got a lot to watch in the future, and I really appreciate being caught up on where we are in the state of current spectrum. So thank you everybody for watching today's event. It will continue to be available on YouTube, and everyone have a great holiday.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Sure.